Imagine stepping onto a steel beam 1,000 feet above the street with nothing but worn leather boots and the hope that your balance holds. No safety nets, no government inspectors, no rules. In the early 1900s, men climbed into the sky every morning, knowing that statistics didn't matter, that their family's survival depended on speed and nerve, and that the price of ambition was written in the ledgers of the dead. They faced winds that could knock a man sideways, equipment that was barely tested, and contractors who had already calculated the cost of their deaths. How did these workers survive in a system designed to let them fail? And what happens when profit becomes the only rule that matters? The New York skyline rose in the 1920s and 1930s like nothing the world had ever seen. Towers climbed past 500 feet, then 700, then touched 1,000 feet into the clouds. Yet the men who built them worked without a single federal safety rule, without mandatory harnesses, without nets or guardrails or any written protection whatsoever. They worked because they had to, because the alternative to the high steel was the breadline, the factory floor where wages barely kept a family fed, or the streets themselves. For immigrant workers crowded into tenements from Dublin to Naples to Guangzhou, the skyscraper offered escape. It offered danger, yes, but it offered wages that could change everything. The price was always blood. What made it possible was a system that had decided in advance which blood it was willing to spend. 1,000 feet was an almost incomprehensible height for most people. In 1930, to stand at street level and look up meant tilting your head back until your neck ached, watching the tower disappear into cloud and haze. The Woolworth Building, the Metropolitan Life Tower, the Singer Building, these were not just tall. They were monuments to what Americans believed was possible when you had enough money and enough men willing to take impossible risks. But the workers on those steel frames didn't think about heights. They thought about the foreman's whistle, about the pace that had to be maintained, about the stack of men waiting outside the site every morning ready to take your job if you showed weakness or fear. They thought about the paycheck that came every Friday and the family depending on it. The work itself was straightforward in concept, but lethal in execution. Steel beams, prefabricated in mills hundreds of miles away, arrived at Manhattan job sites in a carefully choreographed sequence. Every beam had to fit. Every connection had to be true. There was no room for material waste, no room for delay. The city's crowded streets left nowhere to store excess steel, so each piece arrived just hours before it needed to go up. This created a kind of relentless rhythm that defined the entire construction process. The beam came off the wagon. The derrick lifted it skyward. The connectors guided it into place on beams that were often still being riveted together. The pace never let up, because money didn't wait. Every hour a floor was delayed cost contractors thousands, and that cost came directly out of the workers' ability to stay employed. The derrick operators were among the most skilled and most vulnerable workers on the job. These men operated machines that ran on steam and prayer, machines that had no safety governors, no automated shutoffs, no redundant systems. A derrick was simply a tall metal structure anchored to the building's skeleton with guy wires, fitted with a boom that could swing in a full circle and powered by a steam engine that rumbled in the street below, or was mounted directly on the frame. When that boom swung a 2-ton beam over the street, there was nothing but the operator's judgment and experience keeping the load from plummeting. The operator couldn't see half the people his load passed over. He worked on hand signals from a signalman hundreds of feet away. He relied on hemp rope guidelines to keep his mast from swaying. He had to judge distance by eye, acceleration by feel, and danger by instinct. One wrong move meant catastrophe. A beam could swing like a pendulum, threatening not just the men on the steel, but pedestrians on the street below. Equipment failures were common. Guy wires snapped. Steam engines seized. A falling beam could punch through a car or flatten a storefront. The contractors kept the pace moving anyway. To slow down for safety was to cut into profit. To inspect equipment regularly was to lose time. To move cautiously was to signal weakness in a system that rewarded speed above all else. The men knew this. They understood that their lives mattered less than the schedule, and yet they climbed. Every single day they climbed. The riveting gangs that followed the connectors represented something almost beautiful in its deadliness. A 4-man team, each member performing a specific role with split-second timing. The heater crouched beside a portable coal forge, fishing out cherry red rivets with tongs and hurling them through the air toward a catcher positioned 20 feet away on a narrow beam. That catcher snagged the glowing metal in a blackened tin bucket, jammed it into a bolt hole, and braced for the bucker to approach from the opposite side with a heavy steel dolly to hold the rivet steady. Then the riveter opened up with a pneumatic gun that sounded like a machine gun, the compressors whining from the street below, the impact of compressed air flattening the rivet's heated end into a perfect mushroom shape. The whole process took maybe 10 seconds if everything went perfectly. If something went wrong, if a rivet flew wild or a catcher missed or the bucker lost his grip, the results were immediate and terrible. Burns were routine. A missed catch meant a 2,000-degree piece of metal tumbling through the structure, potentially burning someone floors below. Crushing injuries happened constantly. The dolly could slip from sweaty palms and pin a hand. The rivet gun could backfire. A worker could lose his footing from the recoil of the hammer and disappear into the void. The foreman watched the pace, not the safety. If a rivet gang slowed down, they heard about it. If someone got hurt, the injured worker went to a doctor paid by the company or didn't go at all, and work resumed. Efficiency demanded that gangs develop a rhythm that seemed almost superhuman. On the best days, a single gang could drive 500 rivets. 500 opportunities for disaster. 500 successes that meant nothing if the 601st rivet went wrong. The culture of the high steel made refusal unthinkable. Young men, especially immigrants desperate to support families, would never admit fear. The connectors who guided massive steel plates into position while balanced on a 6-inch flange demonstrated a kind of controlled grace that looked almost like bravado. They didn't use safety equipment beyond what they could improvise themselves. Leather belts existed thick and cumbersome, but most workers rejected them because the belts pinched movement, snagged on rivets, and had a tendency to ride up in a fall, potentially crushing internal organs rather than distributing the force of impact across the body. A worker who showed up with a harness might find himself assigned the worst tasks or gradually frozen out of the crew. Reputation mattered. A man who worked fast and without complaint was reliable. A man who talked about safety was weak. The crew depended on each other, yes, but that dependence ran through the channels of speed and efficiency. Mohawk ironworkers from the Canadian border communities of Conowick and Akwesasne became legendary for their sure-footedness and fearlessness. The Jay Treaty of 1794, reaffirmed in court, allowed them to cross the border for work. By the 1920s, entire extended families from these communities had migrated south, settling in Brooklyn's Little Conowick, creating a network of workers who passed jobs from father to son, from uncle to nephew. They were called skywalkers, not as a compliment, but as a description of their role in a machine that was eating men alive. Grandfathers told stories of working in such a way that if something went wrong, it went wrong only for you, never for your family, because you spread yourself across multiple projects, never putting all your relatives on the same job, where a single disaster could wipe them all out. This strategy, called booming out, was a direct acknowledgement that death wasn't a possibility. It was a probability. It wasn't a question of if something happened. It was a question of managing the fallout. The death rate in early skyscraper construction was staggering. Contractors quietly calculated that one worker would die for every $1 million spent on a project. It wasn't rounded down or up. It was baked into the budget. Insurance companies made the math easier by offering liability policies that covered accidental death, which meant that instead of investing in expensive safety measures, companies could simply budget for fatalities. The cost was knowable and manageable. The cost of preventing deaths through better equipment, slower work schedules, or safer practices was open-ended and unpredictable. Insurance created a perverse incentive. The company saved money if workers died because paying out an insurance claim cost less than installing safety nets or bringing in inspectors or purchasing better equipment. Some insurance companies even offered rebates for years with low claim numbers, effectively rewarding employers for high fatality rates that hadn't yet triggered payouts. Records from the era show that death was logged like any other business expense. Labor historians have found correspondence between contractors and insurance brokers, discussing the projected death toll for an upcoming project, the way they might discuss lumber, costs or rental fees for equipment. A worker who died represented a settlement somewhere between $500 and $3,000, depending on his family's ability to press their claim and the contractor's willingness to negotiate. For a man earning $3 a day, that settlement was likely around $1,000. Enough to keep a widow and children alive for a year if they lived carefully, but not enough to start over or wise a business. The families were almost always families of immigrants with minimal English, unfamiliar with the legal system, and desperate enough to take whatever they were offered. The mathematics of death worked beautifully for everyone except the dead and their loved ones. The Quebec Bridge collapse of 1907 revealed what catastrophe actually looked like when the system finally broke. 75 workers, mostly Mohawk men, plunged into the St. Lawrence River in seconds. The bridge's southern span gave way under its own weight because the design was fatally flawed and the warnings had been ignored. Engineers had flagged the bending steel weeks before the collapse. The report sat on someone's desk. The schedule didn't change, the work continued. 33 of the men killed came from the Conaway community, a blow so devastating that it rippled through multiple generations. Widows and fatherless children suddenly represented a community catastrophe. The official inquiry that followed found negligence, design flaws, and ignored warnings. Nothing changed. The Quebec Bridge was rebuilt. More workers died when it collapsed again in 1916, killing 13 more. The system adjusted, families adjusted, the work continued. This was the environment into which the Empire State Building rose in 1930 and 1,931, 3,400 workers. Many of them men who had already survived near misses and losses in their own families, climbed every single day. The project was famous for speed, a floor a day, 13 months to complete what was, at the time, the tallest building in the world. The official death toll stands at 5 workers lost in 13 months of continuous work at the highest intensity anyone had ever attempted. Modern historians note that the actual number was likely higher, lost workers recorded as falling elsewhere or whose deaths were attributed to other causes. But even taking the official count, 5 deaths represents something almost inexplicable given the pace and the conditions. Some argue it was luck. Others point to the discipline of the project manager, who enforced daily safety briefings and maintained strict crew discipline. The project went ahead of schedule and under budget, which should have been impossible if they were actually slowing down for safety. The contradiction suggests that the 5 deaths are an undercount, that some casualties were absorbed into other statistics or simply disappeared from the record. The risk of falls was omnipresent but impossible to prevent with the technology available. A worker could tie himself off with hemp rope, but the rope would fray against sharp edges and could tangle on rivets or catch under his boot in the middle of a delicate maneuver. If he slipped, the rope might save him, or it might snap under the shock load. There was no way to know in advance. Engineers experimenting with better harnesses found that the weight and bulk of heavy leather and steel could actually throw off a worker's balance and make a fall more likely. The only truly safe approach was simply not to fall, which meant perfect balance, perfect attention, and perfect conditions, none of which existed on the high steel. The wind never stopped. The beams swayed. The work demanded speed that left no room for caution. 1,000 feet in the air, a worker had to trust that his body remembered every movement, that his reflexes would react without thought, that the man beside him was equally skilled and equally focused. The turning point came gradually. Then suddenly, the Great Depression forced a reckoning. Federal relief programs like the Public Works Administration began attaching safety clauses to contracts. For the first time, government money came with conditions. Inspectors could demand guardrails, nets, and harnesses on federally funded sites. The Department of Labor issued bulletins spelling out the rules. No scaffolding without rails. No work at height without some form of protection. For contractors who wanted federal money, the math suddenly changed. The cost of safety became a line item in the budget, required by law, no longer optional. Private projects lagged in adoption, but the precedent was set. The old system where death was simply a budgeted expense began to crack. The Golden Gate Bridge, completed in 1937, represented the new thinking. Chief Engineer Joseph Strauss insisted on safety nets despite protests from the board about the cost. Nearly $130,000, an astronomical sum at the time, the nets were made from steel rope, suspended beneath the working areas, designed to catch a falling man and slow his descent enough that he might survive. When workers began to fall, and they did fall, the nets caught them. 19 men plummeted into those nets and lived. They became known as the Halfway to Hell Club, a name spoken with relief and dark humor. The photographs show men standing on the nets after being caught, shaken and bruised, but alive. The visible proof that safety could be engineered changed the conversation. The question was no longer whether you could afford to protect workers. It was whether you could afford not to. But this change in thinking spread slowly. For years, private projects continued to operate under the old rules. Workers still climbed without harnesses, still trusted their feet and their nerve, still faced foremen who calculated the cost of delays and measured lives against schedules. The old code persisted, passed from veteran to apprentice, reinforced by the simple fact that a man who climbed fast and without complaint got more work, more hours, better assignments. Showing fear meant showing weakness. Asking for safety equipment meant admitting you didn't trust yourself. The culture didn't change overnight. It took 1971 and the creation of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to finally make safety mandatory. Federal law, not custom, not suggestion, not the encouragement of enlightened contractors, but law. Anyone working more than 25 feet above the ground required fall protection. Inspectors could fine companies, shut down job sites, hold foremen personally responsible. The old arguments about courage and tradition and the limits of equipment no longer carried weight in court. The technology had evolved to new harnesses made from synthetic webbing with shock-absorbing lanyards and multiple attachment points, weighed a fraction of the old leather belts and moved with the worker instead of against him. The excuses ran out, but the cost of getting here was measured in names. Thousands of workers died so that future workers would not have to. Mothers buried sons who fell because the faster their sons worked, the more money they made. Wives collected tiny settlements that did uncompensate for anything except the permanent absence of the person they loved. Communities like Conowake were scarred by generations of preventable loss. The skyline we see today, every tower that pierces the clouds, every beam and rivet and connection, is balanced on that foundation of blood and sacrifice. The men who built 1,000-foot towers without safety rules, did you do it because they were heroes or because they were stupid? They did it because they had no choice. They needed the work, they trusted that their skill would keep them alive, and they accepted that sometimes skill wasn't enough. Today, when a construction worker puts on a modern safety harness, when an inspector checks the equipment before a shift begins, when a company budgets for proper protection as a line item in the project cost, that worker is walking in the shadow of the men who fell. The rules exist because of them. The protection exists because of what happened to them. Progress stops being abstract when you understand that it was built on the bodies of people with no alternative.